I'm on the grounds here today of the Quinta San Pedro de Alejandrino. This is where Simón Bolivar died in 1830. And I want to talk about, because it's been in the news with what's happening in Venezuela with the U.S., the Monroe Doctrine. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding with the Monroe Doctrine, but James Monroe, one of the founding fathers, as they say, of the United States, who was president in the early 1800s, kind of issued a statement. It wasn't called the Monroe Doctrine when he issued it or when he was president, but basically, long story short, it said the U.S. is not going to take kindly to European powers fooling around in Latin America. Today, in the 21st century and in the 20th century, it has been seen as, oh, the big bully U.S. is trying to be a hegemon and trying to have power over Latin America. And maybe the U.S. has done that, and maybe you might want to argue that that's what's happening right now with Trump. And those are all legitimate discussions to be had. However, when you take the Monroe Doctrine in its original intent, that's not what it was about. In the 1820s, when it was issued by James Monroe, the U.S. had no real navy. It had no real expeditionary force. I wish I could show you. There's a huge iguana over there climbing a tree. I think that's a tamarind tree, but it's really cool. I'm going to try to get a picture of it for the B-roll, and I'm sorry about that. But this is a beautiful place. You really, if you're ever in Colombia, you should come and visit this place, which is a public park now in Santa Marta. It's very inexpensive to get in, 24,000 pesos as of 2026, 30,000 pesos for foreigners, which is just a few dollars. So if you can, come and visit. Not only will you learn a lot, but it's some really cool stuff to see. And they've got a lot of the artifacts and the original houses and things like that, the quintas from back when Simón Bolivar spent his last days here as he died of tuberculosis. But anyway, so the U.S. didn't have any kind of real military like today where it was going to go off and go to war somewhere in Latin America or beat Latin American countries over the head to get one thing or another. That was not what was going on. At the time, you've got to realize places like Colombia, Gran Colombia, places like Nueva Granada, places like Venezuela, they were just, recently getting their independence and were very fragile. And not only were they newly formed countries, but you still had a lot of royalists in Latin America. Even in the 1860s in Mexico, some conservative Mexicans, along with the French government, tried to install, they did install an emperor. They bought an Austrian over from the Habsburg family, the ruling family of the Habsburgs that, throughout Europe, all these kings and queens, and they marry their cousins and all that kind of nonsense. They bought Maximilian over from Austria to be the emperor of Mexico. Now, Mexicans captured him and ended up shooting him and killing him. Cinco de Mayo is actually, most people know this by now, it's not Mexican Independence Day, but it's when the Mexicans beat the French forces in the Battle of Puebla. Okay, so Cinco de Mayo actually celebrates that, commemorates that, as Mexico was fighting for its independence and to not belong to the Habsburg Empire. They wanted no part of that. They wanted to be a republic, and then Mexico got who, in my opinion, has been their greatest president ever in history, Benito Juarez. But again, great conversation. I'd love that stuff. I don't cover Mexico. Maybe as a side project, if you want to hear about that, I can tell you, but there's plenty of sources out there about Benito Juarez. If you fly into Mexico City, the airport's named after him. Cool guy. But anyway, so all of these things were happening. There were still lots of royalists, and there were lots of people who, even though they kicked out the Spanish, they still wanted to have a king, and they wanted to bring in a king that just wasn't Spanish. They wanted to bring in maybe somebody from France or maybe somebody from England or the UK. And actually there was a French delegation that was in Colombia. Simón Bolivar ended up throwing him out because he was an anti-royalist. He did not believe in kings and queens. But the French actually even had a delegation here to work with the conservative Colombians who wanted to install a prince or king or emperor or something like that. remember Napoleon, and this kind of set off the march towards revolution and independence for Latin American countries. What had happened was Napoleon went into Spain and basically took over Spain, conquered Spain, put his brother, I think, in charge. And so those people who were already kind of patriots, or already people who wanted independence from Spain, seized on that moment, seized on the weakness in the there was nobody back home. There was nobody in Spain running things. There was nobody in Spain who was going to be able to mount an army and to come over here and squash rebellion. I mean, there were battles and things like that. There was a fight for independence, but they picked a time when Spain was very weak, when Napoleon had gone into Spain, and then Napoleon himself was having financial difficulties because he had to sell in the Louisiana Purchase, he had to sell their holdings in North America to the fledgling United States, and the Louisiana Purchase that got you everything from Louisiana up into Illinois and those whole territories up and down the Mississippi River. So the Monroe Doctrine at the time was really about keeping, kind of like protecting, and a lot of people in Latin America don't see it like that today, and probably with good reason, don't see it as, it wasn't about any kind of hegemony, because the U.S. wasn't even close to being a hegemon of anything. The whole part of what's now modern U.S. hadn't even been really, I guess you could say, conquered yet. A lot of people would say settled. So it wasn't like, oh, we're going to take over this for ourselves or anything like that. It was really more of kind of a move of solidarity to protect the newly independent Latin American countries from the influence of European colonialists. That's what it was about at the time. Today, a lot of people misinterpret the Monroe Doctrine. A lot of people in the current administration in the U.S. talk about it because they think it means something like, this is our backyard, which is really an awful thing to say, because when you are from a country, you don't want to be in anybody's backyard, right? Mia Mottley, the former Prime Minister of Barbados, actually went off when a reporter or journalist or somebody from the BBC who was like, "You're in America's backyard." She was like, "We're not in anybody's backyard. You can go to hell." It was hilarious. There's clips of it all over YouTube. But let's say in the neighborhood, right? Because of course you have bigger neighbors and smaller neighbors. But let's say in this Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, in this neighborhood. So it is not, or should not. Now, people today, like I said, interpret it differently, unfortunately, in my opinion. But the Monroe Doctrine was not about, this is ours, this is the U.S.'s, and anything like that at all. It really was a move of solidarity at the time to help protect these newly independent countries against the interference and the potential reinstatement of colonialism and of royalty. So that's what the Monroe Doctrine was about. But we see today a lot of people seem to either misinterpret, if we want to be benign, or twist its meaning to something else. But I wanted to share that with you. Tell me what you think. Did I get it wrong? What should it be about? What should the U.S. policy be when it comes to Latin America? There's a lot of, you can make a T-chart and have a lot of good things that have happened. You can also say there are a lot of bad things have happened in history, going back to the 1950s and the good neighbor policy, or going back before then, interventions in places like Dominican Republic, the Spanish-American War, when the Spanish were kicked out again. That goes back to that whole thing of, let's get these European colonialist, royalist out of the Americas, is what that was about. And you had people like Jose Marti and Cuba and things like that, who actually were kind of allied with that help or that stance. When the Spanish were kicked out, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba actually fell into U.S. hands. Cuba wanted and got its independence. Philippines, it was a little bit messier, but they eventually did get their independence that they wanted. Puerto Rico, interestingly enough, stayed as sort of a part of the U.S. It's kind of it's not a state, but it's part of the U.S. Puerto Ricans are born U.S. citizens. And so all of this stuff goes back into history and is tied together. So what do you think? How should it be? What should the role of the U.S. be with its neighbors, the countries in North America, South America, and the Caribbean? Let me know what you think.